1945 to 1970. Why that period? Because, as Phillip says in the introduction, that was an exceptionally fertile time for essays, a period comparable, Phillip notes, to the mid-19th century era of Emerson, Thoreau, and Melville. By that period, because, as Phillip says in the introduction, that was an exceptionally fertile time for essays, a period comparable, Phillip notes, to the mid-19th century era of Emerson, Thoreau, and Melville. We seem to have an echo. Did you hear that echo?
Yeah.
I've not heard that before. Let's hope it goes away. But anyway, Phillip gives a number of reasons for this being, for this having been such a productive period of essays, which I'm sure he'll get into in a minute. And he says he could have filled several volumes with very fine essays from this post-war period, but he limited the selection to just 38. They address a number of enduring themes and together constitute what Kirkus in a review called a celebration of writing on American culture and politics. Phillip will be in conversation this evening with Robert Boyers, a professor of English at Skidmore College and editor of Skidmore's quarterly magazine, Salamagundi, which has been around for more than 50 years now. Robert also directs the New York State Summer Writers Institute and has written 11 books and edited a dozen others. His most recent work is The Tyranny of Virtue. So Phillip and Robert, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Great. Well, good evening. I'm Bob Boyers. I'm an old friend of Philip's and a colleague of his, and I'm glad that you're all here. And I think we're all together wanting principally to hear Phillip Lopate to talk about a subject, a very broad subject about which he knows more than anybody else. So I'm going to start right in with an opening question. Phil, you're bringing out several very large essays, anthologies, 3 big books celebrating the American essay. And I thought to begin by asking whether the American essay, in spite of its extraordinary variety, seems to you essentially different from, the English essay or the French essay or the Italian essay. Is there sort of a distinctive something that we are sort of moved to identify as American, even when the subject matter of a piece by Edmund Wilson or Susan Sontag or Claire Massoud isn't, in fact, America? So that's my opening question. Is there something in particular about the American essay you would wish to identify?
Well, there are roots in the history of the American essay which certainly influence it, like the Puritans, for instance, or the founding fathers and mothers. But I would say that there are some elements that are American. Even when an essay doesn't seem to be explicitly about America, it usually touches on some aspects of American politics and culture and daily life. And then there is something democratic about the American essay. William Dean Howells said he thought it was a particularly American form because everybody could have his or her say, So it's something where, everybody can express themselves, in their own way. But of course, the American essay has learned from the English essay and the French essay and the German essay. And when you add in the fact that that the American population is one essentially of immigrants, there's a lot of carryover, you might say.
Good. Well, let me ask you one more, what I take to be really obvious question, and it's a question that's alluded to by Bradley in his introduction, and that is that in your very recent anthology, you designate the years 1945 to 1970 as a golden age for the American essay. I must say I was a little sort of stunned by that initially when you told me you were working on that volume and you were going to call it that. And then when I thought about it some more and I actually read the anthology, I thought, yeah, that seems right. Could you talk a little bit about why you think those years constituted a kind of a golden age for the essay?
Well, to start with, the essay is a peculiar form. It seems to go through periods when it's very popular, and then when it sort of becomes, you might say, box office poison. So I think that in this period, 1945 and on, Americans were suddenly faced with victory. They were faced with being the most powerful country in the world, and their writers and intellectuals had to figure out what all this meant. What should be their role. So it was a period of introspection and reflection, you might say, and at the same time, there was a flowering of literary magazines and all sorts of media that welcomed the essay. And in a way, it was a period when the American public that was going through a great expansion of education, especially the middle class, was open to receiving knowledge from public intellectuals, from people who had something to say. They were more willing to sit and listen to this kind of thing. And then, of course, there were these burning issues that had erupted or that had continued, such as racism, which was particularly important for Black GIs who were returning to America, and sexism, and environmental questions, because there was becoming an awareness that the environment was being corrupted in a way, and something had to be done. So there were these issues that had to be addressed, and there was the ordinary politics that followed between 1945 and 1970.
Yeah. I want to switch just a little bit to a kind of essay that we don't ordinarily associate with, well, politics and the public sphere, although often there is an overlap. And of course, I'm talking about the personal essay. You are, of course, rightly identified with, celebrated for, occasionally blamed for the rise of the personal essay in the United States. And in fact, I mean, your own personal essays, as you well know, have given courage to many writers, young and old, who would not have ventured to try their hand at that form. I'm one of those people who was very much influenced by you in that respect, as in several others. And yet, the rise of the personal essay, its proliferation in schools of writing at all levels, has not always seemed, at least not to everyone, so great and good a thing. So I wondered if you would speak a little bit about the glories and the dangers of the personal essay, the unfortunate temptations to which practitioners of the form, I can speak here for myself, are often susceptible. Even when those practitioners are moved by the example provided by some of the great personal essayists you include in your anthology, people like Lenny Michaels and Vivian Gornick and others.
So in a way, Bob is referring to the anthology I edited, The Art of the Personal Essay, which did very well and which attempted to launch a kind of canon, or at least an awareness of the possibilities of the personal essay. And I would say in general, for better or worse, that in recent years, the essay has been dominated by the personal essay.
Yep.
So basically, I think this happened in journalism as well, this awareness that that there was no such thing as the objective voice, that essays were written by human beings, and they brought a subjective point of view, and they might as well work with that subjective point of view. So that even, let's say, film criticism, I edited an anthology called American Movie Critics. It seemed to me that every important American movie critic was also writing personal essays about their tastes and how they put together the world. So, in other words, we can't escape the subjective. We're always going to bring our personal experience to anything that we write about. Now, that could be a warming thing. That could be an intimate thing. It could also be a dangerous thing because of narcissism, myopia, and even worse, self-righteousness. So, when you write a personal essay, you have to be on guard against your own rationalizations, your own defensiveness, and your own attempt to show that you're the only smart person in the room.
It's great. You say in your introduction to the recent anthology that the essay form will, at its best, feature, you put in the word preferably, a sparkling literary style.
Yes.
And I can't help wondering a bit about that. Clearly, by sparkling, you don't mean pretentious or show-offy, and yet some of the best essayists do show off more than a bit. They wear their brilliance and their verbal invention on their sleeves. Elizabeth Hardwick sometimes wrote essays that made you feel that you wanted to commit every sentence to memory, to quote it to your friends, to read it again and again to your students. She seemed, some of the time, as she herself said of Henry James in an introduction she wrote to a volume of his selected letters, to be unable to write a sentence without putting a flower in its buttonhole.
And so, she herself said that the essay was like a signature, like a kind of oboe that was running through the whole thing. So yeah. She's an example of that, a very conscious stylist. But I would say that the essay is a combination of consciousness in terms of thought plus style, consciousness plus style, and I think that just a sparkling style alone would not do the trick. You have to have an interesting mind and to take us from one place to another. So basically, it's like the brushstrokes in a painter. You see the subject, but you also see the brushstrokes, and I think that that's important in writing too.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree entirely. And in fact, in related to that question, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the essayists, a number of them included in the recent anthology, whose prose, I would say, does not feature a sparkling literary style. Writers whose prose is more like a window or a clear pane of glass through which we see the elaboration of thoughts, ideas, logical connections. I'm speaking here of writers like the diplomatist George Kennan, or the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, or the sociologist Robert Merton, worthy figures certainly that people in my generation read and studied in school, who never...
We don't think of them as belles lettres, to use that term. We don't think of them as necessarily literary stylists. One of the things I tried to do in these anthologies, the first one, The Glorious American Essay, and this one, The Golden Age of the American Essay, was to open up the way we think about an essay, not just to the literary writers, but to the writers in every discipline and field. So, for instance, it seemed to me that in every discipline, there were some people who wrote very well. And I wanted us to consider essays that were not just literary, but for instance, George F. Kennan's essay on Soviet behavior right after in the post-war period was a very influential one. And some people blame him for starting the Cold War, but essentially he was warning us that the Soviets did not necessarily have our best interests at heart. So it was an important and an influential essay. The same thing could be said about, for instance, Richard Hofstadter's essay on the paranoid style in American politics. These were very meaty essays that were very influential. In my opinion, and we may differ, they were written very well, but they weren't written in a show-offing manner. But they were written in a way that would compel you to read them from beginning to end. And I wanted to show how art critics, theologians, geographers, people in every field were writing substantial essays at this time.
And I think that was a really an essential thing that you did. And I think the gap between some of those essays and essays by people like William Gass or Cynthia Ozick was palpable. And yet, as you say, those essays by Niebuhr and Merton and the others were compelling, and they seemed very well done. I wanted to ask you a question about another kind of writer, a writer who meant a great deal to people of our generation, if I may put it that way. And I don't know how many people any longer read the work of Paul Goodman,
Right.
Somebody I knew in the 60s and 70s. And we are old enough to remember that he once commanded a very wide readership, and that his book, Growing Up Absurd, was especially popular with young people and with radicals who entertained ideas about revolution in the way we think and do business. When I reread the essay you include in your anthology, which is entitled The Universal Trap, terrific essay, I realized that I've missed Paul Goodman and almost forgotten him over the course of the last decade. And I wanted to understand why a writer so bold and original, an essayist like that, could seem even now thrilling and also somehow to belong to another age. So if you would, let me just read you one very, very small excerpt from the essay in your anthology. Again, it's called The Universal Trap. And it's just a few lines. Perhaps in the present dispensation, we should be as well off if it were socially acceptable for large numbers not to read. It would be harder to regiment people if they were not so well informed. As Norbert Wiener used to point out, every repetition of a cliche only increases the noise and prevents communication. With less literacy, there would be more folk culture. Much suffering of inferiority would be avoided if youngsters did not have to meet a perhaps unnecessary standard. One more sentence. Serious letters could only benefit if society were less swamped by trash, lies, and bland verbiage.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, he was writing this piece questioning the notion of universal schooling, and said maybe it isn't necessary. Maybe this is a universal trap, forcing everybody to go through the same school system. Okay, but he was also like a lot of these writers, a kind of gatekeeper, saying, maybe mass culture is actually lowering the whole standards of intellectual endeavor, and so while appearing to be defending folk culture, he was also defending high culture. But in general, I wanted to bring back into the spotlight certain writers who had been very important in their time, and who, because of American amnesia, seem to have disappeared from our consciousness. Why this happens, I don't know. But, even a writer like Norman Mailer, who was so central to the culture, is beginning to disappear in the consciousness of young people. So this was a way of preserving, so many voices who, to my mind, were important in their time and continue to be important, haven't dated, but, for various reasons having to do with commerce, seem to be slipping out of sight.
Great answer. And of course, I as I was suggesting, I think anyone turning to the essays of Paul Goodman would find much that's thrilling, even now. I wondered at your inclusion in the anthology of the Philip Roth essay writing about Jews, not because it isn't terrific. Oh, it's a terrific performance. But because it's a very unusual sort of undertaking. I myself can't think of many such pieces in which a writer goes on for pages and pages, defending himself against criticism and disapproval, and in effect, explaining his intentions. Like you, I guess, I like and admire what Roth says on his own behalf. And, I applaud what now needs saying more than ever before. And I'm just quote very briefly, that fiction is not written, this is Philip Roth, to affirm the principles and beliefs that everyone seems to hold, nor does it seek to guarantee us of the appropriateness of our feelings, unquote. And no less might this be said of essays and poems than of works of fiction. But it is, don't you think, a very unusual thing for a writer, especially a major writer, to devote an entire essay to defending himself and answering his critics, including a guy in Detroit who demands to know why there's so much schmutz in Roth's fiction, and another man, a rabbi, who complains that Roth's depictions of adulterers and masturbators are not adequately balanced. Anyway, it's as you know, a very wonderful essay, a great performance. What about that notion of an entire essay written to answer one's critics?
Well, we know, especially with the new biography of Roth, that he was very thin-skinned.
Yeah.
And he took criticism badly. To me, there are many kinds of essays, and one of the kinds of essays you might say is a rant. This is close to a rant, just as Seymour Crimm's essay "Making It" is close to a rant. And as I've said before at the beginning, you can't escape the subjective. You can't escape a certain defensiveness. And so I just thought this was a good example of somebody really going for defending himself, defending his life, you might say.
Yeah.
Which is one of the ways you can write an essay.
It's great. It's a rather different kind of question. And it's, I think, a very interesting thing you say. You and I have talked about this from time to time. You contend that there is a symbiotic relationship between essayism and liberalism, and that their mutually sort of beneficial overlap has much to do with what you call temperament. And I think that's exactly the right word. Mm-hmm. In this case, by temperament, you mean a willingness to seek what you call the middle way, moderation, and avoidance of system. What you might also call the absence of fanaticism. Would you speak to that a bit?
Yeah. R.P. Blackmer said that the essay was an unindoctrinated form. Mm-hmm. So, and William Gass says something very similar. And so, people identify the essay as something that is not systemic, not systematic, and not fanatical, and something that is able to think against itself, that is willing to entertain skepticism, self-skepticism, doubt, and so on. Now, when I came upon Lionel Trilling's statement that in the years after the post-war period, there was a kind of liberal consensus that it was basically everybody kind of agreed with a certain notion of liberalism. In the middle of the night, it occurred to me that maybe there was this overlap between liberalism and essayism. I'm calling essayism basically the ideology of the essay.
Yeah.
So obviously liberalism came under attack soon enough during the years of McCarthyism and so on. And eventually it came under attack from the left and the right. But there was a certain moment, I think, especially after the defeat of the Nazis, when America was poised as a beacon of tolerance. It had this essentially pluralistic immigrant population, and writers like Robert Merton and Mary McCarthy were writing pieces against racism, against anti-Semitism, and so there was this idea that to accept all kinds of people and not to be fanatical. And it was not a particularly revolutionary period because, to some degree, Marxism had been disavowed because of Stalinism, because of the excesses of Stalinism. So for one brief moment, I think there was a kind of overlap or carryover between the ideologies of liberalism and the ideologies of the essay. This was an idea that I put forward basically to stimulate conversation. You might disagree with it, but I showed by the inclusion of certain essays what that temperament was all about, and that temperament in the essay goes all the way back to Michel de Montaigne, to his desire for equilibrium as opposed to extremism, and the same thing was true of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who saw himself as a kind of middle of the roader. So, yeah. What do you think, Bob?
No, I agree. That's very persuasive to me. That connection, very persuasive. And when I think, even if you talk about the ideology of liberalism as it was practiced by someone like Lionel Trilling, or written about by Trilling in a book like The Liberal Imagination. Mm-hmm. I don't have the book in front of me, but Trilling says in the introduction to that book that one of the motives for the book is to interrogate the premises of liberalism itself. Yes. That seems to me what liberalism is all about at its best, and that's what you get in Trilling at his best. So,
and I too wanted to interrogate the premises of liberalism in this anthology.
Yes.
Now, I must confess that I'm not actually a revolutionary, so I'm probably closer to being a liberal, certainly a left liberal, but a liberal nevertheless. So I'm not just interrogating, but I'm also identifying with.
I'm with you, yeah. You, at one point, you, in your introduction, you quote the writer Gerald Early, a very good writer, to the effect that many Black writers have been attracted to the essay because it is the most exploitable mode of the confession and the polemic. That's Gerald Early's language, right? The most exploitable mode of the confession and the polemic. And so I wondered, do those terms, confession and polemic, seem to you to describe the best essayistic writing of the Black essayists you admire? I mean, of Baldwin, of Albert Murray, of Ralph Ellison, or of essayists today, like Margot Jefferson or Gerald Pinckney or Thomas Chatterton Williams.
Hilton Knowles, yes, exactly. Yeah.
So would you say polemic and confession adequately sort of describe what they do?
Well, I would take a step back and say that minority groups that feel themselves to be outside the mainstream have used the essay, have found it a very available and flexible form to begin to express their own sense of identity and to question their own sense of identity. So, you know, sometimes they put forward as a polemic, and sometimes they can be very wry, like Richard Rodriguez when he writes an essay about Latino, and he kind of questions the whole notion of what it is to be Latino. But we've seen it with feminism. We've seen it with all kinds of Black intellectuals being drawn to the essay. We've seen it with gay writers. We've seen it again and again, using the essay as a way to identify and to clarify their membership in a group, or conversely, their unwillingness to see themselves entirely within that group. And in a way, you could say that was true of Philip Roth's essay about being Jewish. He didn't want to see himself as a Jewish American writer. He wanted to see himself as an American writer. It's again a minority perspective.
Yeah, no, I agree. For me, it's just that those terms, confession and polemic, don't quite, I think, get at the nature of much of the writing of the Black writers that I teach in my classes and whose work I love. I don't see those terms quite capturing, well, for example, what you get in Margot Jefferson's book, Negroland.
Right, which is a wonderful book. Yeah.
Oh, just a wonderful book. And you know, neither confession nor polemic, I think, quite gets that. Anyway,
she's very detached, and she's skeptical of all polemic. She doesn't. I would say she doesn't like the sound of polemic, you could say.
Yeah.
But Baldwin, for instance, does have both confession and polemic. He has a lot more besides, but he has those two things.
Yeah, agreed. Yes. At one point in your introduction to your book, you quarrel a little bit with Cynthia Ozick, who contends, I'm just going to quote these words, that a genuine essay has no educational, polemical, or socio-political use. It is not, Cynthia goes on, a doctrinaire tract or a propaganda effort or a broadside. It is, she says, a stroll through someone's mazy mind, unquote. To which you say, rightly, I think, that an armature of argument is really ought not to be a basis for excluding a work from the kingdom of the essay. So perhaps you might say a bit more about the notion that the essay can have no educational, polemical, or socio-political use, as Cynthia has it. My sense is that would eliminate a lot of the pieces that you include in the anthology, and a lot of other really first-rate essays that clearly do have an educational or instructional virtue. I think, for example, of some of the great introductions to recent New York Review editions of novels by Deborah Eisenberg or Susan Sontag. And those are clearly written with a kind of an instructional or educational purpose. And anyway, just.
Well, the first thing I have to say is that I admire Cynthia Ozick as much as any writer now living, you know.
Yeah.
I am a true fan of Cynthia Ozick. But I'm also slightly perverse, which is why I decided to an argument with her. It's not really an argument, but my mission, and in a way I am a missionary for the essay, was to expand our notion of the essay and to take it away from this form, which feels more like a genteel form, a very pleasant form. But I guess I'm enough of from the generation of the 60s that I think that even essays that don't express any explicit politics can also have a political quality to them. In other words, everybody, you can't escape your politics. And so she says that Thomas Paine's Common Sense, for instance, would not fit her definition of an essay. So in the Glorious American Essay, I put in a section from Thomas Paine's just to show that you could do it. So I love the essay that is exploratory, that follows its mazy, moozy, whatever you want to call it, mind. But I also feel like many essays that pretend not to be argumentative have a kind of undercurrent, a spinal structure of argumentation, whether they like it or not. And so I really wanted the big tent notion of the essay, so there could be essays that were exploratory without any kind of didactic purpose, and then there could be essays that did have a didactic purpose, and both could fit in.
I agree entirely, and in fact, as someone who, like you, much admires and loves some of the essays of Cynthia Ozick, there are essays of Cynthia Ozick that are polemical and didactic. So so there it is.
Trust the writer, trust the poem, not the poet, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, another writer whose work is included in the anthology is a writer that I know we both admire very much. He's a writer I've published quite frequently in the pages of Salmagundi magazine, and he's the writer Wayne Kestenbaum, who's an utterly brilliant and original writer. The essay you include in the anthology is called My 1980s, and it's a great piece of work. But I wanted to ask something about it. As you well know, it is an essay in which the reader is, I'll say, expected, expected to pick up on a vast range of references, names, texts, ideas, not only sort of famous writers and thinkers like Michel Foucault, but relatively obscure writers, films, books, and so on. And if you don't know them, you don't get the joke. You don't pick up on the wit. So my question really has to do with what allows an essay like that, I won't say the essayist, but an essay like that to be so tremendously compelling, in spite of the fact that it won't be accessible, terrible word, accessible to many readers.
Well, it will be accessible to readers who can go with things they don't know. Mm-hmm. When I was a teenager, I read a lot of Russian literature. And one of the things that drew me to Russian literature was all these words like troika and samovar that were not part of my experience in Brooklyn. So I think that you don't have to know everything when you're reading an essay. And I also do feel that, it becomes a form of texture, you might say. So, and I also feel strongly that there are essays that go down very well and are accessible to all readers, and then there are essays that are perhaps more intellectual, that push our brains a little bit harder. I am very wary of an anti-intellectual approach to literature. So I think there should be a range from the accessible to the slightly less accessible, where we have to work our brains a little bit harder.
Great. This is only vaguely related to that question, but there's a connection. Some years ago, you may remember this, Phil, I think we talked about it, but it's probably about a decade ago. Some years ago, Michael Kinsley suggested that much of the writing that we associate with the essay is just too damn long. That really the essayist should be able to say what needs to be said in a couple of thousand words at most. That's what he says, a couple of thousand words at most, and just sort of get out of the way. And to hell with complaints about the writers who are forced by editors to be brief. And so I wanted to ask you, at a time, as you well know, when the long essay is increasingly rare, and editors, even at the major magazines, even at the major quarterlies, say, well, 4,000 words is at most more than enough. Have we lost something? I mean, you've got a couple of rather long essays in the anthology, but I think it's fair to say that the long essay is, for the most part, impossible to publish in most of the magazines.
This is a teaching question as well as an anthology question, because my students, especially my graduate students, many of them come in from journalism, and they're used to this the tyranny of word limits, and in order for them to develop a powerful voice on the page, they may have to go beyond the 4,000 word limit. And so I encourage them to do so. On the other hand, there are brilliant essays that are short, and I included in my anthology columnists, because I think that you can write a column which is a brilliant essay. You can do it in 600 words. So I think that that there is this thing called the long form essay, which actually is turning up more and more on the internet. So the internet may be the way that the long essay is preserved, But I definitely think that there are great long essays. I mean, if you think of Virginia Woolf's, A Room of One's Own, James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. Sometimes you need that space to develop an argument.
No, I agree. There aren't many examples, and there's not in any way a criticism of the anthology, but there just aren't many examples of the review essay. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that.
Yes.
This is a subject that all of us who've spent a lot of our lives, writing reviews, have thought a lot about. We think about, well, what's the difference between a review and a review essay? Well, there's length, of course, for one thing, but there's more to it than that. And we know that some of the best writers around have long done much of their best writing in the form of the review essay. And so would you say that there is a kind of I'll call it a prejudice, a bias against the review essay as a legitimate form of the essay, of the great classic essay?
No, it's very legitimate.
Bill, I'll let you ask that, but after that, let's just jump into a few of the audience questions.
Sure. I mean, a writer like Gore Vidal, who I put in Art of the Personal Essay as a review essayist, was brilliant at the review essay. He would take a book and he would use it as a jumping off point for his own personal essay, critical essay, and so on. And of course, the review essay encourages analysis, which is one of the main virtues of essay writing.
Yeah, good, great. Well, Bradley.
Yeah, there's just some really useful questions here from the audience that I wanted to make sure Phil had a few minutes to address. And one is a very basic one from somebody who is anonymous watching, who asks, if you're new to essays, where do you recommend one begins? Well,
begin by reading, for one thing. my anthologies. How about that?
Good plug.
And then actually, if you find somebody in the anthology that you like, then read all their work, because I do think that essays are not just canapes. They're ways of learning a writer's mind. And once you find a writer who you like, then immerse yourself in that writer. And then another thing you can do is imitate that writer. I have nothing against imitation. It's something that in your inability to imitate exactly the writer you like whether it's Joan Didion or James Baldwin, in the gap between you and them, you will find your original voice.
Now, another anonymous viewer, or for all I know, it's the same anonymous viewer, asks, what are the most popular essays?
What are the most popular essays? Well, I mean,
most popular kinds of essays. Yes.
Well, the most popular kinds of essays. Well, I do think that the personal essay is very popular, but there are times when an issue is very topical, very present, very raw, and people need to read them. So for instance, during the Black Lives Matter movement, which is still going on, of course, in my third anthology, the Contemporary American Essay, I included essays by Darrell Pinckney, by Teju Cole, by Clifford Thompson, that all addressed various aspects of Black Lives Matter. So when something is very raw, or the Me Too movement, for instance, I have an essay by Rebecca Solnit on the Me Too movement. In other words, when everybody is talking about something, that gives the essayist an opportunity to weigh in and makes for a very popular kind of essay.
Could I just jump in there for 1 second too? And that is occasionally, for reasons very various and often complicated, the most popular essays are essays written by a particular someone. So, I mean, Phil has written a terrific book about Susan Sontag, for example. Well, Susan Sontag was a writer whose every essay for about 25 years, pretty much everyone I knew was interested in and talking about, and no matter what she was writing about. And to some degree, maybe not in the same degree, but that's been true of certain other writers as well. So I think that's another odd way of thinking about it.
Well, certainly, certain writers develop a kind of cult or a following, Yeah. And then the mark of a good essay is we want to know what this person thinks about a bar of soap as well as world peace. We want to know what they think about everything.
So Phil, so you mentioned that you do have other anthologies that do have minority essayists and female essayists, but Karen asks why in this latest anthology, why is it so male and why so white?
The white question. I do have a number of women essays, it seems to me, and essayists, and it seems to me that I haven't counted the percentage, but as the decades went on, women became more and more important, and essentially to some degree took over the essay form. But I feel disobliged to defend putting in white essayists if they were very good essayists. So I myself am white, as you may have noticed.
Well, no, I don't think the question is why'd you put
especially in the wintertime.
Why only white and male? That's the question. It's not.
There are certainly Black essayists, Indian essayists, and Hispanic essayists, as well as women essayists in all these anthologies.
Yeah. Now, Melinda says that she's in need of humor. Any witty essayists, past or present, that you would recommend?
Absolutely.
And hello, by the way, to Professor Boyers. I guess Melinda's an old Skidmore English major who enjoyed your classes. So.
Thank you.
Well, I myself am prejudiced in the direction of liking humor and liking irony in essays. because I do believe that in a way, when we stumble on humor, we're stumbling on the truth of things, you know? So I, you know, certainly there are essayists going all the way back, like Charles Lamb and Max Beerbaum, who are very funny and who I love. And then there are essayists like E.B. White, who always have a lot of humor in their pieces. So I think that in most of my anthologies, the essayists do show a spark of humor, whether it's even someone like Irving Howe or Susan Sontag. They always have a sense of humor. I do not particularly like solemn essays. I definitely favor essays that have at least some sense of the perspective that humor can bring.
Great. And let me just say, as a reader of the anthology, there are a number of essays in this anthology that are funny, but there's one that stands out. It's Elizabeth Hardwick's essay called Boston. If you want to laugh out loud reading an essay in this anthology, that's the one to read.
It's rather bitchy, but it's awfully funny.
Oh, right. It's great. Yeah.
And not to plug myself, but my own work has often been very funny, or at least moderately funny, and I'm always drawn to the comic in essays. Yes.
So referring to what you both were talking about earlier about some of those mentioned in this anthology, even maybe who are quite prominent in their day now, being less and less known. Chris asks, what makes a great writer drop off the cultural map?
Well, that's a good question, but you know, before I get into that, I'm just going to say that one of the interesting essays is by a theologian here, Niebuhr, who talks about humor and faith, and why isn't there more humor in religion? What makes an essayist drop off the cultural map? There's only so much room on the cultural map, I think. But what often happens is that writers drop off the cultural map and then they come back. Now there are certain figures, historical figures, some of whom I've featured in the Glorious American Essay, like John J. Chapman, for instance, who certainly is not a household word, but you know, among those who study American studies, they know John J. Chapman. So they never drop off the cultural map entirely. They may not be selling in the hundreds of thousands. In some cases, someone like Lauren Isley, for instance, who I think is a great writer, a science writer, actually sold hundreds of thousands of copies in his day, and now has seemed to, for want of a better term, fallen off the cultural map. Although the Library of America issued 2 volumes of Lauren Isley's work. So we keep trying to bring back these people who deserve to be read, who deserve to be considered, deserve to be part of the conversation. And so it's a retrieval project, you might say. Something like cultural archaeology.
Let me ask you one other question from the audience, and then Bob can ask you the closing question. So this viewer wonders what, Phil, you think of our current moment, specifically with regard to our growing proclivities towards technologically induced quick hits and brevity. This person says, I'm curious about the less than golden age of essay writing.
Well, paradoxically, actually, this is a very good time for essays now. While 25 years ago, publishers didn't even want to put the word essay on the cover of their books, nowadays you had a number of essayists who have followings. So people like Samantha Irby and Leslie Jameson and Megan Dow all have followings, and Rebecca Solnit, and that's just the beginning. I was much more nervous about the influence of technology on the essay, let's say 5 years ago. But I've since come around to thinking that that a good essay, a beautifully written essay, can turn up in a blog, can turn up on the internet, and that there will always be writers who want to perpetrate and shape beautifully written essays despite technology.
Great. Great. Well, shall I ask a final question?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm in some ways, Phil has actually, in one degree or another, spoken to this, but it comes from something that Margaret Jefferson wrote in a blurb, actually, for the anthology, for the Glorious American Anthology. She says that the quests and the conflicts that we find in the essay model the way we need to live now. I'm going to read that again, right? The quests and the conflicts that we find in the essay model the way we need to live now. So I'm asking, in a way, what does she mean? And another word she uses is the word test. The essay, she says, will test our beliefs and desires. Now that language seems to me exactly right, actually. But I thought to ask you, Phil, a little bit to talk about that. I mean, in what way does the essay test our beliefs and desires?
Well, we happen to be living through a time that is very uncertain. I think to some degree, all of us are confused. We're saturated with information, but not necessarily with understanding or wisdom. So the essay becomes a very valuable, useful form for figuring out what it is that we think about something, not what we should think about something, but what we actually do think about something. Not what our peer group tells us to think, but what lurks, inside our minds. And so the essay, from derivation means an attempt. And so we're living in an uncertain time. All we can do is to attempt to understand and to do it with the humility, not of the expert, but of the ordinary human being trying to make sense of the world we live in now.
Right.
Great. Well, Bob, great moderating, and Phil, certainly with anthologies like yours, the essay and our appreciation of essays will live on. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Brad.
I should also mention that Phil will be appearing in one of the classes that Politics and Prose offers, one this spring, called The Glorious American Essay, which is being taught by David Johnson and is scheduled on 4 Wednesdays in late April and early May from 6 to 8. More information about that class is available on PNP's website. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you could find a link for purchasing Phil's book, The Golden Age of the American Essay. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thanks.